BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And just a quick reminder, every Monday is Zodiac Mondays. Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything. That's an AMA, so please drop your questions below for things that you would like discussed here on the show. And Friday is an Anything Goes. Any subject is fair game, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, but any subject is welcome. All right, so please share some ideas in the comment section about what you would like to hear about on this channel, and let's get started. Okay, hello everybody, it is Monday, Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. Now, I would want to begin today by saying that I had a different topic scheduled for Zodiac Mondays, but I began interacting with somebody in the comments section, and then we started communicating a little bit more, and the topic had to have been changed. And anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also reach out on the Instagram page. But I would like to give a big shout out to Kat, that's just how I'm going to be referring to her, for sharing some material. What happened is, over the past several months, and even maybe back into some of the previous years, the Kat has been writing into the comments section, sharing some things about the Zodiac Killer and the Merchant Marine theory. And I, of course, read the comments. We've discussed them in the AMAs and the Q&A sessions about the Zodiac Killer. But it finally came to the point where I had to ask Kat, how are you obtaining this? Like, what are your sources? I would like to read them for myself. And the simple response was, she said a variant of, I didn't read it, I lived it. And I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? And she replied that Darlene Ferrin is her mother. She is the daughter of Darlene Ferrin. And I was like, okay, you've got my undivided attention. We're going to have to be talking a little bit more about this. And the Merchant Marine theory begins by establishing the point that for a large portion of Darlene Ferrin's teen years, she was going to different parts of the world with this individual, a merchant marine. He was much older than her, and I mistakenly said that he was in his 50s previously on the channel, and Kat actually corrected me by saying by the time you get to 1968 and 69, he would have been in his early to mid-60s, and Darlene Ferrin was still a teenager when they first got together, so this would have been something scandalous, but as you can obviously tell, she got pregnant, and they visited different parts of the world, being that he was a merchant marine. So there's this affair that is going on, and it becomes the foundation of a much larger motive for the Zodiac Killer to have been created, and that is that Darlene is going to be the epicenter. Like, if you listen to podcasts or find other YouTube videos, you will find people talking about this, about how Darlene Ferrin is the clue to everything. She's the key to everything. She's the biggest clue in the Zodiac Killer mystery, as a victim who was murdered on the 4th of July, 1969. So I think that we should introduce Kat's theory by stating some things that, and this is all coming from my correspondence with her, and some of the material that she wants to share about her mother, Darlene Ferrin, and her biological father, whom we will call Robert Kimball. I want to be very clear, that is not his full legal name. That is an alias that has been attributed to him, Robert Kimball. So we have to go back to the 20th of December, 1968. And look at the Lake Herman Road murders first. And from time to time on this channel, I ask you guys challenge questions throughout the duration of the recording, but at this time, I think the only challenge question we need to think about is, what do you have to say about this? How do you respond to this theory? And as you listen to this recording, what comes to mind, and share anything that you want in the comments section below. I would love to read your comments, and I would love to read your stuff and see what you have to say. So on December 20th of 1968, we have the Lake Herman Road murders, the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. Then it's not until 7 months later that there is the Blue Rock Springs shooting, and the Zodiac Killer even wrote this in one of the her first letters, stating that I'm going to state some facts that only I and the police know, talking about Blue Rock Springs on the 4th of July, but then also referring to the incident with David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, as Last Christmas. Very large gap. And the merchant marine theory explains this by saying that this guy was only on land during these times. Why the infrequent actions of the Zodiac killer? He was only on land at these times. He was away at sea, or he was occupied with something else. And Robert Kimball wasn't only a merchant marine, he was also a captain, someone who had some status. And if the affair with Darlene Ferrin would get out, and the child, whom would grow up to be Kat, became knowledge throughout the merchant marines, this could cause an enormous amount of complications for him. But as we're going to see, Robert Kimball is someone who's coming from a background of his own trauma, as well as it's more about having an axe to grind with Darlene Ferrin. So is my interpretation of this. And everything you're going to hear about how the murders were committed and how the case has been laid out is just going to be my analysis of the situation, my interpretation of the material that has been shared to me by Kat. So on December 20th, 1968, Robert Kimball is looking for Darlene Ferrin, and he encounters her from a very far distance, or so he thinks, and he sees her with a young man, David Arthur Faraday. But of course, as you can already tell, that's not her. It's a case of mistaken identity. He was trying to find Darlene Ferrin on December 20th of 1968, but he thought that he saw her from far out, and it was actually Betty Lou Jensen getting into David Faraday's car. But Robert Kimball followed the car, waiting for them to stop at an opportune moment, and that happened to be the parking lot at Lake Herman Road, the entrance to the Benicia water pumping station. Anything else that David Faraday was doing that night is just like coincidental, or it's almost irrelevant. This guy was looking for Darlene Ferrin to murder her, and by the time he's firing the bullets, he realizes that he's made a terrible mistake, but there's no turning back now. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were killed for nothing. I mean, absolutely an unnecessary crime. And for the next 7 months, this merchant marine, Robert Kimball, is just so mad at himself, not because of guilt, not because of shame, not because of feeling anything for the victims, but instead he is consumed with the idea of how he made a mistake, and he never resolved the issues with Darlene Ferrin. For years he had been supporting her financially, he fathered her child, and she has cut off contact, she's blowing him off, she is not giving him respect. All of these things have driven him to the point of murder, but as we'll find out in Kat's theory, it's actually something a little bit more than this, although this was my initial interpretation of this. I thought that it was going to be, all right, Darlene Ferrin is the apple of his eye, the target for his rage, and that it was a breaking point. I really thought that when discussing the Lake Herman Road murders, that that was it. That was it. Is that he saw this girl getting into the car with David Arthur Faraday, and he just snapped at that point, and he did this very impulsively. But as I learned more about Robert Kimball, it's highly possible that this was actually a lot more calculated, and that he was doing this in more of a cold, methodical way, and it wasn't so much about reaching any type of breaking point. Instead, he had it in his sights to murder Darlene Ferrin, and almost certainly it would have been based on everything that we will establish throughout Kat's theory. The next event is the Blue Rock Springs shooting, where Darlene Ferrin would have actually been murdered. What would happen with this? Well, Darlene Ferrin would have gone to Terry's restaurant at 10:30 p.m. on the night that she was murdered, and she was actually the time of the shooting is really difficult to pinpoint, but it probably was around between 11:50 p.m. and 12 o'clock. So there's just about a 10-minute gap in which the time frame could have happened where Darlene Ferrin could have been shot by the Zodiac killer. And I say this because Richard Hoffman, the police officer, was doing a patrol in Blue Rock Springs Park, and the only way that that this individual, if it indeed is Robert Kimball, got away with this is sheer dumb luck. I mean, that's it. If there had been this patrol that happened right before the shooting, and then you have the call coming in at 12:10 a.m., that Darlene Ferrin has been shot, it's just a very small time frame, a very small gap in which someone could have driven to the park, shot Darlene Ferrin, and gotten away. But an interesting thing to note about this is that at the Lake Herman Road shooting, we said that David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were killed because of a case of mistaken identity. And, I mean, seeing someone from a substantial distance, I mean, that's definitely, I would have to be quite far away to mistake Darlene Ferrin for Betty Lou Jensen, but they do have some facial similarities compared to somebody such as Cecilia Shepard, whom I've always said really does not resemble Darlene or Betty Lou at all. And you might notice the similarities between the Lake Herman Road shooting and the Blue Rock Springs shooting, except for the fact that the perpetrator walked much closer to the car window, because this guy is thinking, this time I have to see Darlene face to face before I fire the shots, even though he perhaps didn't care too much for the victims, but he wanted to make sure that he was looking at Darlene when he fired the gun. And this expands into a whole nother web of Zodiac theories, actually, that Darlene Ferrin knew her attacker. She met him in the parking lot of Terry's restaurant at 10:30 p.m. on the night that she was murdered. They got into an argument. And even though this guy was fairly certain that Darlene Ferrin was driving that type of car and that she was with Mike Mageau, he followed her anyway to the park, once again waiting for her to be in a vulnerable position. This could also support many of the other claims that Darlene did indeed go to the park to buy some marijuana for her brother, as well as picking up some pills, and Mike Mageau perhaps had his own agenda to be at the park with Darlene, but that's almost beside the point. What is much more important is that Darlene was being followed by this individual, Robert Kimball, the merchant marine, and he targeted her specifically. Now, my question was, well, what do we do with the other victims? Cecilia Shepard, who was stabbed on the 27th of September, and then you have Paul Stein, who was shot on the 11th of October. I mean, how would that fit in if this guy is just out to murder Darlene Ferrin, and the first time he murdered David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen in an unnecessary way? Isn't it just over? Well, if we think about that, 3 murders in this area have been committed within a 12-month time frame, and what is this person going to do? A series of murders was set up to distract the police, to be confusing, committing a series of murders so it wouldn't come back on him. It was a way to get away with this crime. Darlene Ferrin was the primary target, and the rest of these individuals, David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein, were killed as an unnecessary series of murders that was meant to distract the police, to be confusing, so we would never come back to him, so he wouldn't get caught. And this was compounded in with the mailing of the ciphers and the mailing of the letters, and an even greater additional layer is, if we look at the descriptions of the Zodiac killer suspects, some people would say that there is this description of someone who is maybe a little bit shorter at Blue Rock Springs. I mean, 5'8", 5'9", maybe 5'10". Then you have the Lake Berryessa stabber, who is 6 feet tall. Estimates, all estimated, right? Who is 6 feet tall and perhaps 220 pounds. Those are some of the descriptions that have been put forward. And also, Lake Berryessa was committed by knife. Blue Rock Spring was committed by handgun. And then Lake Berryessa is where the Zodiac killer is wearing the hood. The only time he's wearing the hood. Lake Berryessa was the only time the Zodiac killer wrote a message on the car door. Why are there all these differences? Because there was a different perpetrator at Lake Berryessa. It wasn't Robert Kimball. It was his half-brother. And we're just going to refer to him as Breck, B-R-E-C-K. He would be viewed as the perpetrator at Lake Berryessa. So in that costume, it's not the same person that was the shooter at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. However, by the time you get to the Paul Stein murder on October 11th of 1969, this is one that also has its own additional layer of differences. And Paul Stein was murdered for an opportune reason. And the only thing that I will say about this, once again to protect people's privacy and such, is that Paul Stein was murdered because he drove somebody to the airport. Paul Stein was a taxi driver. He drove somebody to the airport who revealed certain information to him that they shouldn't have, and that Paul Stein was a liability. They found out who the taxi cab driver was, and then some guy got into Paul Stein's cab, perhaps near the Pinecrest Diner, and then he directed him to drive to Washington and Maple Street, and then Washington and Cherry Street, and that's where Paul Stein was shot. And this does tie into what Gareth Penn pointed out about the radian. If you put a radian, an angle of 57.3 degrees on top of Mount Diablo, one arm will go to Blue Rock Springs Park, where Darlene Ferrin was murdered, and one arm of the radian, this angle of 57.29 degrees thereabouts, will go to where Paul Stein was murdered in Presidio Heights. So Gareth Penn was onto something about this, and I have to give a shout out to YouTube user Jamie Hendrickson, who pointed out that pilots and sailors will use radians, and Michael Cole was even writing in his book Zodiac Revisited Volume 3 that he believed that the Zodiac killer would have had celestial navigation training, so then that is someone who is a merchant marine. This also ties into what is known as the Tarbox confession. In the early 1970s, Robert Tarbox, the attorney, says that he received a confession from somebody who claimed to be the Zodiac killer. The only thing that he has shared is that it was a merchant marine who walked into his office, paid a small fee, and said, "I'm the Zodiac killer and I want you to be my attorney if I ever need you," something to that effect, and then walked out and was never seen again. The merchant marine. And I expect that many people are going to have their explanations about the Tarbox confession and the merchant marine that was associated with that, but Kat has put forward her suspect. Robert Kimball is indeed that merchant marine who would have been responsible for all of this. And just to recap right now, one individual, Robert Kimball, murdered David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, shot Mike Mageau, and then murdered Paul Stein in October of 1969. But then there was a different individual whom we're referring to as Breck, who murdered Cecilia Shepard on the 27th of September. However, in regards to Robert Kimball's whereabouts at the time of the Lake Berryessa stabbing, he would have been an active participant in planning the Lake Berryessa stabbing, and Kat has written out some notes here about that she would like me to share with you. The murder came in by boat, and Robert Kimball's car was pulling a boat in the background at Lake Berryessa on the very day of the murder. That picture was taken. I also think that while Cecilia Shepard was being murdered, Robert Kimball was up at the Carmen Ghia writing the message on the car door. That's the one that says that this is in Vallejo. There's a Zodiac symbol. It lists the dates of activity: Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and Lake Berryessa, and then it's signed 6:30 by knife. And I repeat, it lists the dates of those activities, but I think you guys are familiar with that. And then it's signed by knife. That was written by the same person who wrote the letters. As far as writing the letters go, Robert Kimball passed away in 1975, so he would not have written the 1978 letter. That one would be just not authentic. And this would also mean that he is present and he is being an active participant with Breck, although Breck is doing the stabbing and Robert Kimball is going to the Carmen Ghia, which, if I recall correctly, would have been stationed 500 meters away from the picnic blanket where Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were. And I would also like to share some other things that Kat has wanted to me to put forward, and this is in regards to the murders of Cheri Jo Bates. Because, all right, we've said the canonical Zodiac crimes, right? If we go back to 1966, I was like, "Do you believe that your father, Robert Kimball, murdered Cheri Jo Bates?" And she said yes. And I would just like to read off her segment here. Darlene Ferrin saw Robert Kimball murder Cheri Jo Bates, so Darlene Ferrin was even present at that time. And this is when she knew that she was done with him and that she was done with me as well, referring to Kat. I remember bits and pieces of this. I remember being placed with this older lady, and it turns out her name was Eunice Nolan. This name was in Darlene's phone book. She was located in Albany, New York. However, when Darlene gave me to her and gave me up, she must have been visiting San Francisco. The lady was horrible to me, and I do not remember too much. I also remember screaming out for Darlene to come back. I didn't say that, but I remember screaming for her, and Darlene just kept on walking. She never looked back, not at once. After that, I remember being extremely sick, and everything went black. The next thing I remember is some old lady is picking me up, and I think I was at the hospital at this time. I think the lady was Robert Kimball's younger sister, Estelle. It goes on for a little bit, but also just saying that Cheri Jo Bates was murdered for a rather similar reason as to Paul Stein, because as a nursing student, she had obtained some information, some way, somehow, in regards to the misdeeds of Robert Kimball, and that's where I would like to leave it at for that. It's just that it wasn't because of her physical appearance, it wasn't because she was in a vulnerable position, it wasn't only about creating a mathematical masterpiece in which the opportune victim came by at a certain time. It's because she had learned something, whether it's she had learned something that she shouldn't have, that could have incriminated Robert Kimball. And if you can't see a pattern that is forming, I think it's a good thing to say that Robert Kimball had been involved with an enormous amount of crimes throughout his life. And, I mean, it's really difficult to even. The crimes of Robert Kimball go back even further. For example, I asked Kat, do you believe that your father, Robert Kimball, would have been responsible for the 1963 Domingos Edwards shooting at Gaviota Beach? I mean, it's not exactly in Gaviota State Park, but very close by. And she said yes. Then it turns out that Kat's family is heavily connected to the Morris family. You might recognize that name on this channel when we did our episode called Zodiac Killer David Gold Theory. David Gold has a book out there called My Dance with the Zodiac Killer, when he talks about his Zodiac Killer suspect, Frank Morris. And Frank Morris was involved with the escape from Alcatraz. He's one of the three major individuals and participants in that. The other two are the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence Anglin. But when Kat was sharing some things with me in the comments section, I could tell she was talking about the escape from Alcatraz, but I was like, now, I don't really think you're saying that Frank Morris was the Zodiac Killer, and any of this David Gold theory is exactly lining up. I'm definitely noticing some major differences between your theory and his. It's almost as if you're saying that there was a different participant in all of that, and indeed there was, and he is the person that we've been talking about, Robert Kimball, the merchant marine who maybe did the Tarbox confession. I mean, this stuff is all alleged, of course, and no one has been convicted for these crimes. But in regards to this, it is that Robert Kimball was an active participant in the planning of that escape from Alcatraz, and even Kat has gone on to say that Frank Morris Jr., the son, was her ex-stepbrother. So this family is heavily connected between the Kimball family and the Morris family. But in regards to the escape from Alcatraz, if I can understand the notes that Kat has written out, it's that there was a female visitor that was going to Alcatraz to visit Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, and she was providing certain information in a coded way that would have established the grounds for the escape from Alcatraz. And a Norwegian freighter noticed somebody in the water after the escape that might have been a person, and it might have been something that resembled a prison uniform, but they weren't even 100% sure because they didn't come forward with that information until 3 months after the escape from Alcatraz. And it's possible that that was someone who was murdered by Frank Morris, the Anglin brothers, and perhaps also something that was orchestrated by Robert Kimball, and that this was something that this could have been an additional murder victim who was then put into the prison uniform to confuse the authorities. And these crimes are going back like further and further, and we'll say a little bit more in just a second. But at this time, I think it's important to talk about what would be the motivation really for all of these murders to have taken place over the course of Robert Kimball's life. When Robert Kimball was 5 years old, his mother passed away in their home. She died as the result of a botched abortion. Remember, abortion wasn't legal in the United States of America until the 1970s, and this becomes a theory that people will have in a lot of crimes prior to 1973 as a reason about why a woman would be bleeding and trying to hide that from people. And, I mean, maybe you can even think of a few true crime cases where that is provided as a theory or an explanation about why things have happened. But she passes away, and Robert Kimball even witnessed some of this, and it must have been a horribly traumatic event that just completely traumatized him. I mean, that his mother died in their home as a result of a botched abortion, and being a 5-year-old kid and witnessing that does sound horrible, but it greatly affected his mental state in a way in which he would go through life and learning how to conceal this type of destructive tendency that he had to commit these actions, but it would just come out at certain intervals that were calculated, but he definitely had a way to keep that type of rage in check. And one point that Kat would like to share with us about the crimes that were committed by Robert Kimball. It's possible that he was the Phantom Killer from 1946 in Texarkana. This is the series of murders that is known as the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. And in regards to Robert Kimball having any involvement with that, is that he was stationed in Texas, and what the notes that Kat has written out is his ship was in the port in Texas, and he was there in 1946. He has gone back and discovered this that he was there because of his DD-214 documentation, and if you look it up on Google Maps, the port in Texas is a straight shot away from the location. So he was in that area in 1946. And when we were looking at this, because David Gold's theory, My Dance with the Zodiac Killer, also states that his suspect, Frank Morse, committed the Moonlight Murders, the Zodiac Murders, although there's a different Lake Berryessa stabber, and then the D.B. Cooper hijacking incident. But let's look at the Moonlight Murders in 1946. And then the Zodiac murders, which began in 1968. So you have at least a 22, 23-year difference between the Zodiac murders and the Moonlight murders. And with many suspects, I would simply just say that would be impossible. I mean, in some instances, it would be impossible. If you look at Louis Myers as a Zodiac killer suspect, he would have been 17 at the time of the first murder. And he wouldn't even have been born in 1946. But with somebody such as Robert Kimball, who would have been in his early 60s at the time of the Zodiac crimes, 22, 23 years, then he would have been in his early 40s at the time of the Moonlight murders. And then that would be someone who was just committing a crime spree that would have gone on for about 3 months from February to May of 1946. And this is the Phantom Killer, and the person that you perhaps have seen. They made a movie about the Moonlight Murders called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. He almost always wore a hood, targeting lovers' lanes, but deviated from the lovers' lanes on the last crime. And then this is really just the MO, and it's a larger theory that often you will hear about, where there's this serial killer that is able to fly under the radar by moving from city to city, by changing his MO, by changing certain characteristics. And so many people are like, why did the Zodiac killer cease activity after October 11th of 1969? I mean, of course, the Zodiac continued to write letters into the 1970s, but that truly ceased because Robert Kimball passed away in this theory. But in regards to about why there are so few Zodiac killer victims, whereas many other serial killers would murder way more than 5 people, it's that this was a serial killer who is moving from location to location, changing his MO, changing his signature, changing the type of costume that he would have been wearing, or wearing the costume only one time, or how about using other participants in this series of murders. It's all to evade capture, because a characteristic of psychopathic and sociopathic serial killers is that they are primarily focused with predatory instincts about how to hunt without getting caught, as horrible as it sounds. And you can even see this laid out in Kat's theory about how 4 of the Zodiac killer victims would have been murdered by the same person, but the Lake Berryessa stabbing would have been committed by a different person. And this individual, Breck, who would have been the Lake Berryessa stabber who murdered Cecilia Shepard, was dealing with his own mental instability issues and impulse control. And the Lake Berryessa stabbing on September 27th of 69 is much more personal than the crime that took place at Lake Herman Road, the crime that took place at Blue Rock Springs. The killer's having a conversation, the victims are tied up. This is an incident where you would have someone who is really trying to unleash a little bit more sadistic tendency. There's a little bit more sadism that is going on with the Lake Berryessa stabbing, and that could tie into some points that have been mentioned about Breck's instability. Another point that Kat wanted to share about her theory in the Zodiac Killer mystery is the radian that is put on top of Mount Diablo. Gareth Penn made the famous claim and observation, and it's really Hugh Penn, his father, that made this statement that 99% of the population wouldn't use the word radian in their working vocabulary. Then Gareth Penn is the one who takes the radian and puts it on top of Mount Diablo and finds out where the points go to. And Kat has something to say about something that Robert Kimball has done, and that was an invention called the Greenwich Time Finder, and he does have a patent for this. In the pattern of are the words radians and meridians. Only 1% of the general population uses these words. Plus, the invention had to do with maps, kind of like a GPSD. Must be a GPS device. That must be what that means, as well as today. But in the 1950s, the Zodiac loved maps, and he would use the same words. I mean, the Zodiac did also mail in the Phillips Petroleum map, and also highlights the thing about Mount Diablo. And yes, the Zodiac was definitely into maps, and perhaps somebody like a merchant marine would be very familiar with those things. So, to continue, with going back to some of the material about Darlene Ferrin, my first connection to this was, I did an episode and Kat responded to this in the comments section and saying, how did you obtain the information that Darlene Ferrin had been running around the world with this merchant marine for a period of time that was at least 6 months, although I'll just kind of finish that thought real fast. How did you obtain this information? And I said, I heard about it in an interview with Thomas Henry Horn, not the one that I did on this channel, but on someone else's show. And Kat responded by saying, oh, well, I'm the source for that. Thomas Horn interviewed me, and I'm the one who provided that info about Darlene Ferrin going around with this merchant marine. So then the next thing to say as an additional layer onto that is that it is something that has been somewhat widely established that there is a merchant marine that is involved, that Darlene Ferrin had this large chunk of her life that she didn't want to talk about. And I definitely think it would have to be a little bit more than 6 months. And now, Kat has written some notes in here about that. And it sounds like it would have been at least a year of her life that would have been involved with this departure, or definitely closer to 9 months that she would have been away with this individual and going around. But also, Kat wanted to share something about how she did have an encounter with Mike Mageau in the 1990s, and I would like to read off a little segment that she has written out. In the 1990s, I can't remember the exact date, but I was working in Seattle on Lake Union, and some girlfriends and I went out for drinks after work at a place called The Lamplighter. It's kind of a dive bar, and I went up to the bar to order drinks and looked over at the man who was sitting at the bar to my left and said hi. He literally jumped back in his chair and turned ghostly white. I was like, whoa, what's up? Guess who it is? I didn't know who this was at the time because I was clueless to all of this, but after watching some interviews on TV, I learned that this individual was Mike Mageau, and the way that he talked and that the way that he sounded. I did talk to him that night, and he told me I looked like an old friend of his. I wasn't really much into talking to him, but I guess I was somewhat rude at the time, but the guy followed me around that night and wouldn't let me leave. He wouldn't leave me alone. So I went off telling him off and told him to leave me alone. Years later, I found out that that was Mike Mageau, someone who had recognized the similarities between Kat and her biological mother, Darlene Ferrin. In regards to Darlene's involvement with this, I even noticed that she was mentioned much more frequently than other Zodiac killer victims. I noticed that this whole thing about Darlene's the epicenter, even back in 2019, I just made a comment once. Her name keeps coming up very frequently. And if you watch the 3-part Zodiac series by John Lorden on his channel, Lorden Arts, he's the one who just put it in the biggest nutshell version. Darlene is the key. It always comes back to her. And I think that this theory could be presented in 2 different ways. The first is that you would have just the 5 canonical murders, and there are 2 other victims who survived, Mike Mageau and Brian Hartnell. If you simply wanted to say that this was a plan to murder Darlene Ferrin and to get away with it by murdering other innocent people, to make it look like there's this type of cold, methodical, and calculating serial killer on the loose, mailing in the letters and the cryptograms. Those would more or less be not exactly red herrings, but they really wouldn't be as important as it seems, that this is some clue to revealing the killer's identity. No, this is someone putting out weird and confusing messages so they won't get caught. It's creating the murder mystery that can't be solved simply to hide the fact that this person had a personal issue with Darlene Ferrin, which definitely is a little bit more than just a dispute. As you heard, this guy would have fathered a child with Darlene. He would have been supporting her financially for years, and then she would have cut him off, and then he's trying to see her. She's rejecting him. He's trying to find her. She's ignoring him. And this leads to a large set of destructive tendencies that were perhaps always there with Robert Kimball if he did indeed commit all of these crimes. But I told you the challenge question at the beginning. What do you have to say about this? And what is your response to the theory that has been put forward by Kat? And she says she's the biological daughter of Darlene Ferrin, and that her father, Robert Kimball, was the Zodiac killer. And being clear one more time, that is not his legal name, that is an alias. So please share your thoughts about this in the comment section below. What do you even think about the group murder theory that has been put forward, that it would have been Robert Kimball and his half-brother committed the Zodiac murders together? If you have anything to say at all, please drop your responses in the comment section below. I would love to read them. And you can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com, BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.